Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was just starting to drop behind the jagged ridge when the most feared cowboy in the territory rode into the dust-blown town of Red Ridge. His name was Gideon Falk, and men crossed streets to avoid his path. He wore black from boots to hat, and his Colt sat low on his hip, easy to draw and quicker than most could think. Folks whispered stories about him, how he once shot 3 men in a saloon without spilling his whiskey, how he never stayed in one town for more than a week, how no woman ever got close enough to know if he had a heart left. But on that particular evening, a woman was about to change all of that. Her name was Viola Danner, and she was 23, with a spine straight as a rifle barrel and eyes the color of storm clouds. She had come to Red Ridge 2 months back with nothing but a battered carpetbag and her younger brother's 2 children clinging to her skirts. Their mother, Viola's sister, had died of fever crossing from Texas. The father had been gone long before that. Viola had taken the children in without a second thought. She worked mornings at the schoolhouse and evenings at the bakery, doing whatever she could to keep food on the table for little Opal and Oliver. She did not have time for fear, not of hard men or hard days. Which was why, when Gideon Falk stepped into the bakery just as she was closing, she did not flinch like most folks did. She glanced at the revolver on his hip, then met his gaze straight on. "You here for bread or trouble?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He blinked once, then gave a short answer. "Bread." Viola nodded, pulled a warm loaf from the shelf and wrapped it in brown paper. "That'll be 5 cents. He laid a coin on the counter and paused, watching her. "You always speak that plain to men like me, only if they're buying bread." She handed over the loaf, her hand brushing his. His skin was warm, rough. He held her gaze a second too long before nodding once and turning away. From the back room, a small voice called, "Auntie, I found Oliver's boot." Viola turned her head. "Good, now get washed up." Gideon hesitated with his hand on the door. "Yours?" Viola looked back at him, eyes narrowing just slightly. "My sister's," she passed. "They're mine now." He gave a single nod, then left without another word. The next time she saw him, it was 3 days later. A scuffle had broken out near the livery between 2 ranch hands, and the sheriff was nowhere in sight. Gideon stepped in, quiet and calm, and broke it up without drawing his weapon. Viola saw it from across the street as she held Oliver's hand, walking them home from school. "You know who that is?" whispered one of the schoolboys. Viola did not answer. She just watched the way Gideon stepped away from the fight, all control and silence, like a man carrying something heavy inside. That night when she closed the bakery, he was waiting again. "You work too much," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You keeping track?" He looked at her and something shifted behind his eyes. "You need to rest. Kids need you strong." "You giving advice now, Mr. Falk?" He looked away. "Just saying. You do not strike me as someone who says anything he does not mean." "I don't." She leaned her elbows on the counter, tired but not ready to leave. "You got children somewhere?" He shook his head once. "No, never had someone stay long enough." There was a pause. She watched him, saw the way his jaw worked before he spoke again. "You ever afraid?" "Of what?" "Men like me." Viola's eyes never wavered. "I'm not afraid to love, Gideon, even if the world's been cruel." His posture shifted, his shoulders dropping just slightly. "That's dangerous. So is crossing a desert with 2 children and no money. I did that already." He glanced toward the back where the children were settling into sleep, then he looked back at her. "You got a lot of fight in you." "I got a lot to fight for." He nodded once. "I'll walk you home." They walked side by side through Red Ridge's quiet streets. She did not ask why he was staying in town longer than his usual week. She did not ask why his hand hovered near his gun even in peace. And he did not ask why her fingers trembled when they brushed his arm just slightly when stepping around a puddle. A week passed. He started showing up after sundown, sitting outside the bakery and waiting for her to close. Sometimes he brought the children little things: a carved horse for Oliver, a wooden hair comb for Opal. Viola never asked where he got them. Gideon never explained. He never touched her. Not until the night a drunk man tried to follow her home, slurring something ugly about women who spoke too bold. Viola stood her ground, but before she could speak, Gideon stepped from the shadows. The drunk froze. I didn't mean nothing, you did, Gideon said, his voice low. Now leave. The man turned and ran. Viola looked at Gideon. You always hiding in the dark, not hiding. His eyes found hers. Watching? Then he reached out and gently touched her cheek. Just one touch, her breath caught. Why are you still here? She whispered. His hand dropped. Because you are. 2 nights later, Viola kissed him. It was not planned. The children had fallen asleep. She had walked him to the edge of the bakery and said good night. He had hesitated, then turned to go, and something in her snapped. She caught his hand, pulled him back, and kissed him like she had been thinking about it for days. He kissed her back. Slowly, carefully. Like he was afraid he might break something. When they parted, she whispered, I'm not afraid of you, Gideon. He pressed his forehead to hers. You should be, she smiled. I am not afraid to love you. He let out a breath like it had been caught in his chest for years. Then he kissed her again, and this time it was not careful. It was real. By the next week, he had moved into the spare room at the bakery. He started helping with the deliveries. The children took to him quicker than anyone expected. Opal called him Mr. Giddy and Oliver followed him like a shadow one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars. Viola leaned against him and murmured, You are not the man people say you are. He kissed the top of her head. Maybe not anymore. She looked up at him. Stay for good, he nodded. I already did. And for the first time in years, Gideon Falk knew what peace tasted like. It was warm bread and the smell of soap and the sudden burst of laughter from a child who trusted him. It was Viola's hand in his and the sound of her breathing beside him at night. It was home. The spring rains came late that year, soaking the mesas and sending green threads creeping across the red earth. In the early mornings, before the sun burned the dew away, Viola would step onto the porch with her shawl wrapped tight and a tin mug of chicory in her hands. Gideon was already up most days, cutting kindling or checking the hinges on the door. He'd reinforced himself. He didn't say much in the mornings, but his presence was steady, like the weight of a trusted rifle across the back. One Sunday, as the children played under the cottonwood behind the bakery, Viola brought out a tin of beans and a heel of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Gideon sat cross-legged beneath the tree, whittling a spoon for Opal, who had asked for one small enough to fit her doll's mouth. Viola handed him the food and sat beside him, knees brushing his. You always work with your hands when you're thinking. He glanced at her, then back to the wood. Keeps me from saying things I might regret. Like what? He hesitated. I've been thinking about building a fence around the back. For the children, keep strays out, maybe plant squash come summer. She watched his fingers move, slow and sure. That sounds like something a man planning to stay would do. His jaw tensed. I am staying, I know, I just like hearing you say it. He set the knife down. I've never built a fence for anyone before. Viola reached for his hand, turning it palm up. A pale scar marked the base of his thumb. There's a first time for everything. Later that week, while she taught figures and letters to the town's children, Gideon set posts. He worked without asking for help, measuring twice, tying twine, hammering until his shoulder ached. He wore no hat, and by midday his neck had browned deeper than before. When Viola came home, Oliver ran to her, shouting about the new fence and how sturdy it was. She thanked Gideon with just a glance, but that glance held more than any words. That night she found him on the bakery roof, patching a leak near the stove pipe. She climbed the ladder without calling out. You aiming to fix the whole town? She asked. He looked down. You'd be surprised what a man'll do when he's got something worth keeping dry. She sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. The stars were coming on, slow and scattered. Do you miss drifting? She asked. He took his time answering. Used to think I needed the road. Turns out I just hadn't found a place that didn't spit me back out. Viola rested her head against his shoulder. This place isn't perfect. No, but it's got you in it. She smiled into the dark. And 2 children who think you hung the moon. He let out a long breath. They ever ask about my past. They ask why your hands are so big and how you can carry both of them at once. That's about the extent of it, he nodded. I keep expecting someone to ride into town, someone who knows the old parts of me, try to stir it up again. She straightened. If they do, they'll have to answer to me first. He looked at her, and there was something unguarded in his face that hadn't been there before. You don't flinch even when you should. You've got calluses and regrets, Gideon, but I've got my own. We're both still breathing. That's what matters. He kissed her then, not like he was claiming her, but like he was giving something up to her. A piece of whatever he'd carried all those years. When she pulled back, she whispered, I know you're not proud of everything you've done. I'm not, he said. But I'm proud of what you are now. The next morning, the sheriff came by the bakery. Viola was kneading dough, sleeves rolled past her elbows, flour dusting her cheek. Gideon stood behind the counter, sorting sacks of rye. Falk, the sheriff said, scratching his temple beneath his hat. Got a telegram this morning. Man from Bisbee asking after you, name of Harlan Tate. Gideon's posture didn't change, but Viola saw the stillness settle over him like frost. What he want, didn't say. Just that he was headed this way. Said he owed you something. Gideon wiped his hands on a cloth. He ever been through here? Not that I recall. Viola didn't speak until the sheriff left. Then she turned to Gideon. You want to tell me? He leaned back against the counter. Tate and I rode together once, long time ago. He's not a man who forgets a debt. Is he dangerous? He's clever, that's worse. She didn't ask more. Instead, she reached for the cloth and wiped the flour from her cheek. Then we'll be ready. He watched her for a long time. You say we like it's always been that way. She folded the cloth slowly. It has, you just didn't know it yet. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He sat outside, rifle across his knees, watching the road in the distance. Viola came out near dawn, wrapped in a shawl, and sat without a word. When the sky started to pink, he turned to her. If something happens, it won't. Still, if it does, I'll protect the children, and I'll wait for you. He nodded once, throat tight. I never thought I'd have something to lose. She took his hand in hers. You don't. You have something to keep. The train came 2 days later, hissing and heavy with the scent of coal smoke, its whistle splitting the quiet afternoon. Viola stood on the bakery steps with a bowl of soap water in her hands, watching the platform from across the street. Gideon didn't say anything when he stepped onto the boardwalk beside her, but his eyes were already fixed on the tall man who stepped down from the third passenger car, wearing a pinstriped coat and no hat. Harlan Tate carried his past like a badge, sharp creases in his trousers, fine leather boots polished to a shine, and a silver watch chain glinting at his waist. He walked like he owned every inch of ground beneath him and looked at Red Ridge like it was already disappointing him. Gideon set his jaw. He came dressed like he expects someone to care. Viola didn't look away from Tate. Do we? No, but he'll try to make us. They didn't speak again until the man crossed the street, headed straight for the bakery. Viola stepped inside, dried her hands, and stood behind the counter while Gideon waited on the porch. He didn't enter. Tate pushed open the door with one gloved hand and smiled the way a man does when he's already made up his mind about you. Miss Danner, he said, offering a brief nod. Word is you bake the best bread between here and Tombstone. Viola folded a cloth over the fresh loaves cooling beside her. It keeps folk fed, that's enough. Tate glanced around. Charming setup. I admire a woman who can make something out of nothing. He turned to the doorway. You always did know how to pick them, Gideon. Gideon didn't move from the porch. Why are you here? Tate stepped back out, brushing past Viola's counter without buying a thing. You owe me a day, 1 day to talk. That's all. I don't owe you anything. Tate smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. You saved my life once, remember, just trying to return the favor. I'm not interested. You will be. I'll be at the livery come morning. He walked away like he already owned the answer. That night, Gideon stood in the back room, oiling his rifle. Viola sat on the floor beside the stove, unwinding Opal's braids and checking for tangles. Oliver had fallen asleep under the quilt, thumb tucked against his cheek, breathing steady. You going to meet him? she asked without looking up. I haven't decided. You have, he set the rifle down gently. I just don't know what comes after. Viola laid the comb aside and got to her feet. Whatever it is, we'll meet it the same way we've met everything else. He didn't speak, but when she reached for his hand, he took it. At sunrise, Gideon saddled the roan gelding he'd been boarding at the livery. Viola handed him a parcel wrapped in waxed cloth bread, jerky, and a wedge of dry cheese. He tucked it into his saddlebag without comment. She didn't kiss him goodbye. She just said, "Come home before supper." He nodded and rode out. The trail Tate chose was north of town, through the low canyons where the mesquite grew thick and the ground turned to rock. Gideon followed the tracks until he found him sitting beneath a bluff, hatless again, coat folded neatly beside him. "You came," Tate said. "That's something?" "I'm not here to reminisce." Tate poured 2 cups of coffee, the tin kettle set on a flat rock beside him. "You remember the Prescott job? The one we walked away from, both of us bleeding like stuck hogs." Gideon stayed on his feet. "That was a long time ago. Not so long. I think about that day every time I breathe through this busted rib." Tate tapped his chest. "You dragged me out of that fire. I should have left you, you didn't, and I'm here to give you something for it. I don't want anything from you." Tate reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "There's a man in Tucson, names himself Judge Arlen, carries a list. Your name's on it." Gideon didn't move. "Word is he's paying for old blood," Tate went on. "I figured you should know. I've kept your name out of things, but a list like his doesn't stay quiet long. What do you want in return?" "Nothing. Except to look you in the eye and see if the man who used to ride beside me is really gone." Gideon took the paper, read it, then folded it and slid it into his coat. "He is." Tate stood. "Then I suppose I'll ride back alone." "You do that." They parted without shaking hands. By the time Gideon returned to town, the sun was low, and the street lanterns were being lit by the old stableman with the oil can and ladder. The bakery windows glowed warm against the dusk. Viola was outside sweeping the porch, her braid undone and straying in the breeze. She looked up when she heard the hooves and didn't smile, just waited. He dismounted, tied the gelding, and climbed the steps. "Well," she asked, "there's a man in Tucson who wants to bring the past back." "Are we running?" "No," he said. "We're planting squash this summer." She nodded once. "Good." Inside, the children had set the table with 2 spoons and a single knife. The stew was hot and thick, and Opal had drawn a picture in charcoal on a scrap of paper. Viola, Gideon, and 2 stick children under a crooked sun. He sat down beside the hearth and took the bowl Viola handed him. "This is what I want," he said. "You already have it." And he did. By mid-May, the cottonwood behind the bakery had leafed out thick and silver green, its shades stretching long across the yard by late afternoon. Gideon had finished the fence and added a narrow gate that latched from the inside. Viola had taken to hanging laundry along a line strung between 2 posts, and the children ran barefoot now, their feet tough as bark. One evening she found Gideon kneeling in the dirt beside the house, shaping a low mound with a flat spade. "You're early," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Ground's soft from last night's rain," he said, not looking up. "Thought I'd start the squash." She crouched beside him and pressed her fingers into the soil. "Your planting close to the wall gives it protection," he said. "Wind's rough in June." She watched the way his hands moved, methodical and sure. "You learned that on a ranch?" "No," he said. "From a blacksmith's wife in Sonora. She kept a kitchen garden in an old trough, said even steel needed something green nearby." Viola leaned back on her heels. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if things had gone different?" "Sometimes," he said. Then, after a pause, "But I'm not sure I'd have liked that man." She stood and dusted off her palms. He wouldn't have known what to do with a squash vine. Later that week, a letter arrived addressed to Viola in a hand she hadn't seen in over a year. It came folded into thirds, sealed with wax, and brought by a freight driver who asked if she was the teacher with the 2 children. She read it in the back room while Gideon fitted a new hinge on the cellar door. When she emerged, her face was unreadable, the letter folded once more and tucked into her apron. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "My aunt in Fort Bowie," she said. "She's ill." "Wants to see the children," he nodded once. "How sick?" "Bad enough she's thinking in terms of goodbyes." "Do you want to go?" Viola set her hands on the edge of the counter. "I think I need to." He didn't ask for details. That night, he counted out coins from the small tin they kept behind the flour sack and handed them to her without a word. She didn't protest. The next morning, she packed a small trunk with the children's clothes and her own shawl, worn soft along the edges. Gideon secured their train fare through the postal agent, and by evening they were seated together on the edge of the bed, Opal curled between them and Oliver already asleep on the floor beside the stove. "You'll come back," he said, not as a question. "I'll be back before the squash flowers open," she said. "You'll need help with the harvest." He stared at the darkened window. "I don't like being still when you're not here." Viola turned his face toward hers. "You've never been still, Gideon. You've just been waiting." The train left at first light. Viola didn't cry, and neither did the children. Gideon stood on the platform until the last car vanished into the horizon, then turned and walked home without speaking to anyone. The days passed slow. He kept the bakery open in the mornings, selling what he could manage, simple loaves, nothing fancy. The townsfolk were surprised to see him behind the counter, hands dusted in flour, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Some gave cautious nods, others quick glances, but no one asked questions. By the second week, he'd stopped checking the road each evening. Instead, he worked until dark, then sat on the porch with a tin cup of water and the small carving knife Opal had once used to shape a lopsided spoon. He carved a new one out of cedar, smaller, smoother. Near the end of the third week, a letter arrived. The same courier. Gideon accepted it in silence, opened it beside the stove, and read it twice. Viola's handwriting was careful, her words plain. Her aunt had passed quietly 2 days after their arrival. The children were well. She would return soon. The following Friday, just after the noon bell rang from the schoolhouse, Gideon heard the slow clatter of hooves on the main road. He stepped outside, wiping his hands, and saw them, Viola seated behind the driver on a freight wagon, Opal and Oliver nestled against her sides. She didn't wave. Just smiled, small and sure, like she'd never been gone. By the time they reached the bakery, the children were already clamoring to show him a pine cone they'd found on the way. Viola stepped down last, her skirt catching on a nail in the wagon bed. He reached for her hand before she could speak. "You're late," he said. 2 days at most. That's late." She leaned into him, forehead resting just below his collar. "I missed the smell of yeast in my sleeves." He held her there, one hand still on her back even as the children ran toward the fence. That night, after the children had gone quiet and the hearth was banked, Viola leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the garden plot. "They are going to take root here," she said. "You sure?" "They are already growing toward the light." He stepped up beside her, slid his hand into hers. "So am I," she said. And neither of them looked away. By early June, the squash vines had begun to creep along the fence line, their broad leaves casting shadows on the dry earth. Viola kept a small journal now, just a handful of pages torn from the back of an old ledger, where she marked the days by what had bloomed, what had withered, and what the children said that made her laugh. Gideon never asked to read it, but he watched her write sometimes, quiet as a man memorizing something he didn't want to forget. One morning, she found him at the old workbench behind the bakery, shaping a narrow wooden box with dovetail joints. He didn't look up when she approached, just brushed a curl of shavings from the lid. "What's it for?" she asked, setting a hand on the bench's edge. "Opal's drawings," he said. "She keeps them under her pillow, they won't last there." Viola studied the joints, each one precise. "You could have used nails. I wanted it to hold." She reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out a broken pencil stub. "She'll be proud." He took the pencil, rolled it between his fingers. "Oliver's been asking if he can help with the shop. Says he wants to learn the bread. You think he's ready?" He's been watching your hands more than mine." That evening, Viola let Oliver crack the eggs into the dough, his fingers sticky with flour and pride. She guided his hands, let him make mistakes and correct them, and when the bread rose uneven, she told him it was honest work, and that mattered more than pretty. Gideon watched from the doorway, arms folded, not interfering. A week later, the town held a gathering by the churchyard, a midsummer supper where each family brought what they could. Viola made 3 loaves and a crock of stewed beans, while Gideon carried a bucket of fresh well water on his shoulder, pausing only once to adjust the weight. As they crossed the dusty yard, Viola glanced sideways. "You ready to let folks talk to you like you're one of them?" "They already do," he said. "They just haven't said it out loud yet." She smiled and shifted the basket on her hip. "Well, they'll have to get used to the idea." "I'm not going anywhere." The preacher's wife was the first to greet them, her hands flour-dusted from biscuit making. She eyed Gideon's calloused palms, then glanced at Viola with something close to approval. "You've been busy," she said to Viola. "Busy's easier with 2 sets of hands." The evening passed soft and slow, fireflies rising from the grass, children shrieking with joy as they chased each other around the benches. Gideon sat with Oliver on his knee, pointing out constellations while Opal braided blades of grass into a crown and set it on Viola's head without a word. As the sky deepened, music began, a fiddle and a dulcimer, played by 2 ranch hands with more enthusiasm than skill. Couples began to dance, boots scuffing the earth, skirts catching the low light. Viola turned to Gideon. "You ever dance?" "I've stepped on enough feet to call it a warning." She held out her hand anyway. "Then I'll lead," he let her. The dance was slow and easy, just a sway and turn under the gathering stars. Viola's hand fit in his like it belonged, and when she looked up, her eyes didn't search for anything. They already knew. "Feels like we've been dancing longer than this," she said. "We have," he murmured. They returned home well past dark, the children asleep in the wagon, their heads resting against each other. Gideon carried them both inside, one after the other, and Viola unpinned her hair by the hearth while the fire burned low. When he came back from settling the blankets, she was waiting barefoot, quiet, her hands folded. "You never asked me to stay," she said. He stepped closer. "You never needed asking, but I want to hear it." He took her hand. "I want you here, Viola, not just beside me, with me." "Every day that comes." She studied his face, the weight of the words settling in her chest like something meant to last. "I already chose you," she said. "Now I'm just making it clear." They married the following week in the small churchyard beneath the cottonwood. The preacher's wife made a cake dusted in cinnamon, and Opal walked ahead tossing wildflowers from her apron. Oliver stood beside Gideon, solemn as a judge, and handed over the iron ring they'd shaped together in the workshop. After Viola and Gideon walked home on foot, the children running ahead, the heat of summer pressing into the road. She wore no veil, just her everyday dress, and he'd shaved that morning with care. That night, once the children were asleep, Gideon stepped outside alone. He stood by the garden, the vines now thick and curling, small blossoms tucked beneath the leaves. Viola joined him, her shawl draped over one shoulder. He looked at her in the moonlight. "You think peace can last?" She nodded. "It does. When you choose it every day. And love, that too." He reached for her hand, and she gave it. They stood in the quiet, the scent of turned soil and warm bread lingering on the air, and listened as the wind moved gently through the fence Gideon had built with his own 2 hands. Inside, the fire crackled low, steady, and sure, and the home they'd made together waited, full of breath and warmth and promise. And they never left it. Not for the road, not for the past, not for anything less than what they had already found in each other.